The dog was already dying when Sloane Merritt, no, scratch that name. When Tegan Rourke walked into the emergency bay at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, she almost missed him entirely. Let me start over with clean output, checking names against the blacklist silently, then beginning. The dog came in on a Tuesday night, and nobody wanted to touch him. Tegan saw him the moment the doors slid open. A German shepherd in a tactical vest, one front leg wrapped in a field dressing that had soaked through completely, the gauze gone dark and stiff. He was lying on his side on a gurney that two men in civilian clothes were pushing too fast across the lobby tile. Behind them, a third man in desert-worn fatigues walked with a limp he was trying very hard to hide. His name tape read OC. His eyes were fixed on the dog. Tegan was supposed to be charting. She had 17 open notes and a 12-hour shift that had already gone 14, and she was standing at the nurse's station with a cold cup of coffee and absolutely no intention of getting involved in whatever this was. She got involved anyway. "Hold on," she said, stepping around the desk. "What happened to him?" The man with the limp, Osi, looked at her. Not at her badge, not at her scrubs, at her face. The way combat veterans looked at people when they were deciding whether to trust them in the next 3 seconds. "Shrapnel," he said. "About 4 hours ago, we came straight from the airfield. The vet clinic on base is closed, and the on-call said he couldn't get there for another 2 hours." He paused. "I wasn't going to wait 2 hours." Tegan looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. His breathing was shallow and too fast. His gums, when she pulled back his lip, were pale going on white, and she'd been a nurse long enough to know what that meant. "Get him into Bay 3, she said. One of the men in civilian clothes, younger, maybe 25, with the kind of flat effect that meant he'd been awake for 36 hours, said, "Ma'am, this is a human hospital. Bay 3, Tegan said again. "Now." She was already moving. His name was Ranger, and he was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois who had, according to OC, found an IED that would have taken out an entire convoy 6 months ago. He had a service record longer than most of the staff on shift that night. He had a handler who hadn't let go of his vest since they came through the door. What he didn't have was a functioning femoral area, and the field dressing wasn't going to hold. Tegan had done wound care on dogs exactly twice in her life, both times on her neighbor's lab when the clinic was closed and the dog had gotten into something it shouldn't have. She knew enough. She knew that the bleeding needed to be controlled, that the dog needed fluids, that the pale gums meant he was going into hypovolemic shock, and that if she waited for a vet who was 2 hours out, Ranger wasn't going to be there when the vet arrived. She worked quickly and quietly. OC stood at the foot of the gurney with one hand resting on Ranger's haunch, talking to him in a low, steady voice, not commands, just words, the kind of murmuring that people do when they need to believe the thing they love can still hear them. The young aide who had objected in the lobby stood in the doorway and said nothing. Tegan was halfway through the wound irrigation when she heard the heels. Director Patrice Wynn had been the administrative director of Mercy General's emergency department for 11 years, and she had a particular way of walking that every nurse on the floor could identify without looking up from their charts. It was a specific cadence. Measured, deliberate, the footfall of a woman who had learned that the sound of her approach was itself a form of authority. Tegan heard it and kept her hands where they were. "Nurse Rourke, give me 2 minutes," Tegan said without turning around. "I'll need you to step away from." Wynn stopped. There was a pause that lasted exactly as long as it took her to process what she was seeing. Is that a dog? Belgian Malinois, military working dog. He's in shock. This is a human medical facility. I'm aware. OC had gone very still. He was watching Wynn the way he'd watched Tegan when she first walked up, that same 3-second assessment, but his conclusion seemed different. "Ma'am," he said, "my dog saved 14 lives on his last deployment. I would appreciate it if you'd let the nurse finish what she's doing." Wynn didn't look at him. She looked at Tegan. "You need to stop. He's bleeding. That is not our patient." Tegan pressed a clean pad against the wound and held pressure and said, very quietly, "He will be dead in 20 minutes if I stop now." She finally looked up. "So I'm not going to stop." The room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor was beeping. One of the overhead lights buzzed faintly, the kind of flicker that maintenance had been promising to fix for 6 weeks. Wynn said, "Finish what you're doing, then come find me." She left. The heels retreated down the hall. Tegan went back to work. She knew what was coming. She'd known it from the moment she heard the heels on the tile, maybe from the moment she told the men to take the dog to Bay 3. You didn't miss 11 years on this floor without learning to read the weather, and the weather right now was unambiguous. She finished the wound care. She got Ranger stable. His gums had gone from white to pale pink, his breathing had evened out, and when she pressed 2 fingers gently to the inside of his leg, she could find a pulse that was thready but present. Osi looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something between gratitude and the particular devastation of a person who has been holding their breath for hours and doesn't quite believe they can exhale yet. He's going to need a vet, she said, real wound care, proper imaging, probably antibiotics, but he's stable enough to transport now. Osi nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, thank you. It was 2 words, but the weight in them was not small. Tegan stripped off her gloves and said, "Let me know how he does," and walked out of Bay 3 and down the hall toward the administrative wing, because she was not going to make Wynne come find her. The meeting was short. Wynne was already seated when Tegan arrived. There was also a man from HR named Greer Doyle, who had the look of someone who had been pulled out of bed and resented it, and a tablet on the table with something open on it that Tegan didn't need to read to understand. "What you did tonight was a significant liability issue," Wynne began. "I stabilized a patient who was in critical condition. He is not a patient. He is an animal. This hospital's insurance coverage does not extend to veterinary care, and the use of our medical supplies, our facilities, and our staff time for—" "The dog would have died," Tegan said. "I was not going to let him die." Wynne looked at her. There was something in her face that Tegan had never seen there before. Not anger exactly, more like discomfort, as if she understood, on some level, what was being said and found that understanding inconvenient. "This isn't about the outcome," Wynne said. "It's about protocol. You acted outside your scope of practice. You used hospital resources without authorization. You ignored a direct instruction from a supervisor." Tegan waited. Doyle cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, we'd normally be looking at a formal written warning and a suspension. But Director Wynne has determined that the pattern of behavior tonight represents a fundamental issue of compliance that—" "She's terminating me," Tegan said flatly. Wynne said, "We're accepting your resignation, effective tonight." "I didn't resign." A very small pause. "We're separating your employment, effective tonight." Tegan looked at her for a long moment. There was a specific kind of clarity that came to her in moments like this. Not peace, exactly, but something that felt like the ground becoming firm under her feet. She had worked this floor for 8 years. She had held the hands of people who were dying. She had stayed late and come in early and covered shifts and skipped lunches and learned the name of every patient's dog and every patient's kid and every patient's fear, because that was the job. Because the job's not paperwork and protocol and liability coverage. The job was the person in front of you. And if the person in front of you was a dog who had found an IED that would have killed 14 soldiers, then the job was still the job. She said, "Okay." Doyle blinked. He'd probably been expecting an argument. "I'll need my personal items," she said. "My locker has my coat and my bag. My car keys are in the bag. Security will escort you," Wynne said. "I know." The security guard was a man named Broderick who had been working nights at Mercy General for about as long as Tegan had, and who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. He walked with her to her locker without saying anything, and when she pulled out her coat and her bag and her half-empty travel mug, he said, in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Rourke." "Don't be," she said. And then, because she meant it, it was the right call. He nodded once. He walked her to the employee exit, not the front lobby, the side door, the one that led to the staff parking lot. She had walked out of this door at the end of 1,000 shifts. Tonight it felt different and exactly the same. The November air was cold and very still. There were no stars visible through the cloud cover. The parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, just a scatter of cars under amber security lights. She sat in her car for a while without starting it. She was not going to cry because she wasn't entirely sure she was sad. What she felt was more complicated than that, something that sat between indignation and a very quiet peace. The way you felt when you had made a decision you couldn't undo, and you knew it was the right one, and you were still going to have to live with all of it. She picked up her phone. She called her sister, Delia, who answered on the third ring sounding half asleep, and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Tegan said. I got fired. A pause. What? Why? I treated a dog. Another pause. Longer. Then Delia said, was it a good dog? Tegan thought about pale gums going pink. She thought about OC's hand on the haunches of his dog, talking in a low, steady voice. Yeah, she said. He was a really good dog. She didn't expect anything to happen after that. She drove home. She slept for 6 hours. She woke up and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, thinking about severance packages and nursing licenses and whether the hospital board had anyone on it who would care about what she had done or why. And the answer she kept arriving at was probably not. She had a text from one of the nurses on her unit, Carrie Holt, who had been there 12 years and had the institutional memory of someone who had watched 3 administrations come and go. The text said, "Heard what happened. For what it's worth, half the floor would have done the same thing. The other half is just better at lying to themselves." She had another text from an unknown number that turned out to be Ose. "Ranger is okay. Vet says he'll make a full recovery. I told some people what happened. I'm sorry if that causes problems." Tegan stared at that last sentence for a while. She wrote back, "How did you get this number?" A pause. Then, staff directory on the hospital website. I'm sorry if that's weird. She almost smiled. She wrote, "It's not weird. I'm glad he's okay." She set the phone down and went back to her coffee. She did not know, yet, what I told some people meant. She found out 36 hours later. She was in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, still in the clothes she'd slept in, going through job listings on her laptop, with the particular grim focus of someone who knows that paralysis is not an option, when she heard the vehicles. It wasn't one vehicle. It was multiple. She could tell from the sound, the way the engines overlapped, the way they pulled up in sequence rather than the single thump and silence of someone parking. She went to her front window and looked out. There were 3 SUVs with government plates and a black sedan, and 2 men on the sidewalk who had the specific bearing of people for whom military posture had become involuntary. Shoulders back, eyes forward, the slight forward lean of people accustomed to moving with intention. They were in civilian clothes, but they wore them like uniforms, and in the middle of them was OC. And next to OC, on a leash, walking with a slight stiffness that was going to take a few weeks to resolve, was Ranger. Tegan opened the front door. OC said, "I owe you an explanation." She looked at the men around him. She looked at the vehicles. She said, "Apparently." His full name was Staff Sergeant Kwame OC, and Ranger was not his only service record. OC had done 4 tours. He'd been attached to units she had clearance to hear about in only the broadest terms, and so he gave her the broadest terms. Special operations overseas, the kind of work that didn't have press releases. Ranger had been with him for the last 3 of those tours. The IED that Ranger had found 6 months ago, the one that would have taken out a convoy of 14, had also taken out 2 of Ranger's toes, which was why the leg had never fully healed, which was why, on a Tuesday night 4 hours out from a training exercise gone wrong, a piece of shrapnel finding the old wound was not just an injury but a potential ending. The men around him were not all from his unit. Some of them were. One of them, a woman about Tegan's age with the rank insignia of a captain and a name tape that read Alara Swick, was from a different office entirely, and it was she who spoke when OC had finished the summary. "We became aware of what happened at Mercy General the night before last," Swick said. She had a directness about her that Tegan appreciated, not hard, exactly, just efficient, the way people became when they'd learned that time was finite and honesty was faster. "What you did for Sergeant OC's animal and what was done to you afterward has been brought to the attention of several people above my pay grade." Tegan said, "That sounds ominous." Swick almost smiled. "It isn't meant to be. I want to be clear about something. We can't compel a private hospital to reverse an employment decision. That's not how any of this works, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She paused. "What we can do is make certain that the people responsible for that decision are aware of who they were dealing with, and aware that the people who care about Sergeant OC and animals like Ranger are paying attention." Tegan looked at OC. He was watching her with the same careful steadiness he'd had in Bay 3, but there was something additional in it now. Something that looked quietly like the beginning of an apology. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you didn't have to do what you did either." What happened in the following week was not a movie. Nothing exploded. Nobody got arrested. Director Wynne did not have a dramatic moment of public reckoning where she confessed the error of her ways in front of an assembled crowd. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more permanent. Captain Swick and two people from a JAG office met with the hospital's legal team on Thursday morning. Tegan was not in that meeting, but Carrie Holt was, because Carrie Holt had been a witness to what happened in Bay 3, and she had the kind of memory for specific times and specific words that made her exactly the person you wanted in a meeting like that. She texted Tegan afterward. They were very polite. The lawyers got very quiet about halfway through. On Friday, a piece ran in a regional Veterans Affairs publication. Tegan hadn't spoken to anyone from the publication. She didn't know who had. The piece didn't name her by name, but it described in considerable detail a military working dog who had survived 4 years of active deployment only to nearly die in a hospital parking lot while a nurse lost her job for refusing to let that happen. By Saturday, it had been shared widely enough that she started getting calls from numbers she didn't recognize. On Monday, she got a call from Mercy General's chief medical officer, a man named Dr. Aldous Penn, who had been there longer than Wynne and who, Tegan suspected, had opinions about the way the last week had unfolded that he had not previously felt empowered to express. He was careful about what he said. He didn't apologize on behalf of the institution, not explicitly. What he said was that the circumstances of her departure had been reviewed, that there were questions about whether proper procedure had been followed in the review process itself, and that if she wished to return to her position, that conversation could be had. Tegan held the phone and thought about what to say. She thought about the cold air in the parking lot on Tuesday night. She thought about sitting in her car in the dark, not crying, trying to decide what the ground felt like under her feet. She thought about Ranger walking up her front sidewalk with a slight stiffness in his step, and his tail moving like he was glad to be there. "I'd like to have that conversation," she said. She went back on a Wednesday. She walked in through the front lobby, not the employee entrance, the front lobby, and she nodded to the woman at the front desk who had been there for 15 years and who watched Tegan cross the lobby with an expression that was not quite professional neutrality. Her badge still worked on the staff door. She found out later that Wynne had failed to process the deactivation, an administrative oversight that some people on the floor were treating as meaningful and others were treating as incompetent, and Tegan suspected it was simply the latter, but she noted it. Carrie Holt was at the nurse's station when Tegan came around the corner, and she looked up and said, "There she is," in the tone of someone who had been waiting for a specific bus and was relieved it had finally arrived. "How's the floor?" Tegan asked. Short-staffed, obviously. "Mrs. Petraglia in Bay 2 is asking for you by name because apparently you're the only person who gets her IV on the first try, and Broderick from security wants to know if you want your half-empty coffee mug back because he put it in the break room fridge, and it's been there since Tuesday, and it's starting to become a thing." "Tell him to throw it out," Tegan said. "I'll get a new one." She sat down at her station. She opened her chart queue. She had, by her count, 17 open notes from 8 days ago that were going to need to be addressed. She started at the top. Director Wynne was placed on administrative leave 6 weeks later, pending a review of HR processes in the emergency department. Tegan heard about it secondhand, from Carrie, who heard it from the nursing supervisor, who heard it from someone who had been in the meeting. The official language was about compliance issues and process irregularities. The unofficial language, the kind that traveled through hospital floors the way it always did, was more direct. Tegan did not celebrate. She didn't have complicated feelings about it, exactly. She had simple ones. The same ground-level steadiness that had come to her in the HR meeting, the same uncomplicated clarity. Wynne had made a decision. The decision had consequences. That was the whole of it. What she thought about more, in the weeks after she came back, was O.C. He had sent her a photo the week after she returned. Ranger, outside, running across a field somewhere, the stiffness in his gait mostly resolved, his tongue out, his ears forward. O.C.'s hand was visible at the corner of the frame, holding a ball he was about to throw. She had put that photo on her phone's lock screen, which was something she almost never did. She thought about the way he had talked to his dog in Bay 3. She thought about the 3-second assessment, the specific quality of attention he gave to things. She thought about a man who had done 4 tours of things he couldn't fully describe and had come home and found that the clearest expression of everything he had been through was a 70-pound dog who needed to hear his voice. She sent him a text. "How's the recovery going?" He wrote back within 2 minutes. "Vet says he's cleared for light work. He's insufferable about it." She smiled. "What does insufferable look like for a military working dog?" A pause. Then,
"He stares at me until I put his vest on. Then he stares at me until I take him somewhere interesting.
Then he stares at me on the way back like he knows he was good and he's waiting for me to acknowledge it." She read that twice. "He sounds like he was always going to be okay," she wrote. "Yeah," O.C. wrote back. "But I needed someone to make sure. Thank you for being that someone." There was a particular thing that happened to nurses sometimes. Not all of them and not often, but sometimes, where they arrived at the end of a very long run of very hard days and realized that they had been, without knowing it, waiting for a sign that the job still meant what they thought it meant when they started. Tegan had started nursing at 24, 8 years ago. She had started because her father had spent 3 weeks in an ICU when she was 22, and there had been a nurse there whose name she still remembered, a woman named Margot, who had worked nights and had the specific skill of making you feel, in the worst possible moments, that someone was paying attention. Not to the chart, not to the monitors, not to the liability matrix of modern medicine, to the person. She had wanted to be that. She had been, she thought, mostly that, with room for error, with the inevitable accumulation of scar tissue that 8 years of emergency medicine produced, with all the compromises and rationalizations and bad weeks that were part of any job that involved human bodies and human pain. But Tuesday nights happened. A dog on a gurney happened. A moment where the choice was clear, and the cost was equally clear. And she made the choice anyway. Not because she was brave, not because she was making a point, but because she was standing in front of something that needed her, and she was a person who could not make herself look away. She thought about that sometimes, on the late shifts. She thought about it when she was charting at 3 in the morning, and the floor was quiet, and the monitors made their steady sounds, and somewhere down the hall, a patient was sleeping. She thought about it when she passed Bay 3 and saw the small scuff on the tile where the gurney wheels had tracked, a mark that the cleaning staff kept meaning to buff out and somehow never did, she thought. I would do it again. And then she went back to her charts because the job was the job, and there was always another patient, and the coffee in the break room was fresh, and Broderick from security had replaced her mug with a new one that had the hospital logo on it and a sticky note that said "Welcome back" in handwriting that was trying very hard not to be sentimental about it. She kept the mug. She kept the photo on her lock screen. She went back to work.